The name of today's webinar is A Profile in Reading Success, How St. Paul Public Schools Uses Assessments, even remotely, to guide instruction. Today's webinar is being brought to you by EdWeb and Illuminate Education, who is the provider of the Fastbridge assessment system. I'm Libby Tracek, like I mentioned, I'll be your host. We just want to take a second to thank you all for the extraordinary work that you are doing this year to help your students make their way through all the various challenges that we know COVID has brought to the school year. During today's presentation, we will learn about the science behind learning how to read and the 5 core components that are necessary to have effective reading instruction. We will also learn about the importance of using valid and reliable assessments when understanding which reading skills your students may be struggling with. And we will also have the privilege of hearing from Sue Braithwaite. She is the supervisor of literacy for the St. Paul Public Schools, and she has been instrumental in helping her district improve reading instruction and student outcomes by creating a culture of data fluency. And then lastly, we will open it up for Q&A. Let me introduce our 2 presenters today. Dr. Kyle Wagner is a research associate with Illuminate Education. He has several years of experience as a school psychologist in both Texas and Minnesota. He also has several publications and presentations on topics including psychometrics, curriculum-based measures, and academic intervention. Sue Braithwaite is a supervisor of literacy for the St. Paul Public Schools. Previously, she was a literacy coach and elementary school teacher for over 23 years. Sue has a passion for deepening understanding about how students learn to read and for building students' passions for reading while also using data to inform instruction. We are thrilled to have both of you on our call today. Dr. Wagner, you may begin.
All right. Hi, everybody. And just to reiterate, thank you all for the work you're doing every day, and thank you for joining us today. So my role is going to be kind of the intro with some context and background of the science of reading and kind of how we think about reading and tracking reading. And then Sue's going to talk and say the important things. And then I'll jump back in at the end and talk a little bit about psychometrics and what to look for in a reading assessment tool. But let's kind of jump in here with the science of reading. So our goal as educators and supporters of educators is to give our kids and our students what they need to be successful in life. And in this context, those tools are reading proficiency and reading comprehension. The tool we want to give them is the ability to be a proficient reader, because that's just going to be a necessary skill and something they need to have. So that's what we try and do, is get that into them. So to do that, we need to understand reading and how reading breaks down. And you all probably know this, and it's certainly easy to look up the papers on it. But there are 5 essential elements of effective reading instruction. There's phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And as we dig into this a bit deeper, we see that there's kind of a path forward through these skills, right? We move, particularly with those first 3, from one to the other. We can't be fluent readers before we understand phonics and how phonics work with words and reading. We can't be good with phonics until we have some phonemic awareness and we know what the sounds are. And then those build into vocabulary and comprehension. So another way to think about this is from the simple view of reading, which is another setup, which is another kind of paradigm for reading instruction. And they're all kind of built in the same building blocks here, where we have decoding skills. So this is phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency. And it's language comprehension, vocabulary and comprehension. And this leads together to reading comprehension. So like I mentioned before, I'll just kind of, we'll show this time again. Again, you need these components to become a proficient reader, right? And so phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency, this is a progression. Again, it's really hard to build fluency without that phonics component, without understanding that A can be A or A B is a B sound, right? We need to know these phonics things. We need to know phonemic awareness. We need to be able to hear those sounds and repeat those sounds and understand those sounds. We need to progress through those skills. With language comprehension, we can work on vocabulary and comprehension kind of in parallel. And we can work through these, and students pick up a lot of these skills by listening to language and engaging in language. But again, they're necessary components, because we can have all the fluency we want, but if we don't understand vocabulary, we don't understand these comprehension skills, we're not going to be proficient readers. Similarly, we can know words and we can know how words fit together in language, but if we can't put together those orthographic components, the looking at a page or looking at a screen and seeing the letters come together in phonemes and morphemes and words, then we're not going to be proficient readers. So what we have is a map, right? We've got a start point, we've got an end point, and we've got all these places to go along the way. But what's missing from the map? There's a very important component that's missing. And what's missing is where our students are, right? We can have a map. We can have a detailed map. We can have a map with every single point of interest and directions and distances and every piece we need. But if we don't know where we are, we can't get to where we're going. And so this is where the importance of these tools, these assessment tools, come in. Because with a good assessment tool, we can start narrowing things down. We can start figuring out, well, student has that skill. They're past there. Oh, student doesn't have this skill yet. This is where our kid is. And this is what we need to know. Because again, there's these components of reading, and there's this understanding of what reading is and how we become proficient readers. But to instruct students, to bring that good scientifically based instruction, to bring our passions and our skill sets and transfer that knowledge to students, we need to figure out where they are first. And so this is the importance of a good assessment toolkit. And with that, I went too far. I'm going to hand it over to Sue.
All right. Good afternoon or good morning or good evening, whatever time of day it is, where you're at. First of all, I'd like to just thank you for joining us, and then also thank you for the work you do as part of school systems. And we're in a pandemic and trying to do distance learning, hybrid learning, in-person learning. And so just really acknowledging that. But I'm excited to be here today. I am very fortunate because I've had the opportunity to work in St. Paul schools for the past 28 years. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about St. Paul. We have 37,000 students in St. Paul. We're the second largest school district in the state of Minnesota. We have over 125 different languages throughout our 65 schools and programs. So we have students that are in schools and different types of programs. We have immersion, Spanish immersion, French immersion, Chinese immersion, schools among dual immersion program as well. We are 34% of our students are EL students. We have 15% of the students are SPED students, and 70% of students are free or are on free or reduced lunch. We have a 76.9% graduation rate, and this is our third year using Fastbridge. And so to sort of start us out with what is St. Paul and where does our district come from? I have the privilege of being the supervisor of literacy for the district for the past 5 years. And so part of our kind of instruction and getting into kind of a curriculum adoption that we were entering into, it was decided before we can actually buy materials, what do students in St. Paul actually know? And so finding out what kind of an assessment tool that we could use to really gauge, to figure out if we're buying resources, what are we buying? So sort of to what Dr. Wagner said is we have all these, we know the science of reading, we know what we call the 5 pillars of reading, we know all of those things, but then we also need to tie that into what do the students know and build on that strengths-based model of what do they know and where do we need to take them. And so part of our process really initially was, what do students in St. Paul know? But we also had a set of criteria that we were really looking for and trying to determine what would be the right tool for us to use to assess our students. And the first one was really reducing testing time. We had our previous systems took weeks and weeks and weeks to administer. And then truthfully, teachers didn't actually use the data very much. I don't believe we did a good job of teaching teachers actually how to look at the data. to be able to make that instructional decision. So kind of our first criteria was how can we reduce testing time? We also, never in the history of St. Paul have we had the opportunity to have an assessment that went from kindergarten through like ninth grade, and we particularly chose ninth grade for that transition year. So in St. Paul, we have K-5, 6, 8, 9, 12 schools. And so for our transitions from 5th to 6th and from 8th to 9th, we felt it was really important that we needed an assessment that kind of scanned through that area. We were also intentional with other testing that happens in 10th, 11th, and 12th grade with ACTs and our state testing and things like that, that we felt like we had enough information after 9th grade. That's what we thought. And then we had all of a sudden teachers reaching out in 10th grade saying, wait a minute, we need data too. Like, what do we, like, this isn't fair. We want to have data information as well. And so we expanded our assessment window until in some schools for 10th grade as well. The other thing is this was a huge push for us in St. Paul, was really empowering teachers to make instructional decisions. And I actually use that word empower because when we're thinking about, we have curriculum, we have resources, we have frameworks, we have all kinds of ways that we're teaching students, or we're delivering information or disseminating information to students. But how can we take what we know from data to empower teachers to make instructional decisions? And that really came down to what kind of tool would give us information that would reduce testing time, that we could span it out, but also empower our students to make decisions. And then my favorite part, and we're going to do a little activity in a little bit, is really looking at growth over time. So then what kind of assessment would we be able to say, we're going to assess, we assess in St. Paul 3 times and progress monitor in between, but from September to January, when we assess again, what kind of growth? So we are able to see growth over time as well as growth over previous years. And so teachers have data sets of information that help them inform instruction. So that was another kind of piece, is really looking at how can we analyze from year to year, but also from beginning of school year, middle of school year, and end of school year. And then iPad accessible. We are a 1-to-1 iPad district in St. Paul, so every 37,000 students have their own district issued iPad. And so the opportunity to have an opportunity for students to be able to take the assessment in their classroom in a space that feels comfortable to them, that they spend their time with the teacher administering them, versus necessarily going to a computer lab to have to do that. We do that in some places, but we did want like the flexibility of being able to assess in with an iPad. Sorry, my earbud popped out. And then finally, our kind of final criteria when we were looking at assessments was really thinking about how do we change our beliefs about assessments. For many years, myself included, the district told me to test, and so I gave assessments. And then, so how do we change this belief that the assessments can inform instruction? And in order to inform instruction, we have to empower teachers to be able to make instructional decisions. So what did we learn? And so this is, as I mentioned, our 3rd year of using Fastbridge. And what we learned from our data is that we needed phonics materials. So when you think about those 5 pillars of reading, and you think about phonics, fluency, comprehension, vocabulary, phonics is in phonemic awareness. And so what we learned was we needed phonics, but we also then looked at what our current materials were and recognized that this is our first place of our curriculum adoption, because you can imagine with over 1,000 elementary teachers, 27,000, about 24, 5, 6,000 elementary students, really taking that data to figure out what do we need to do in order to support reading and early reading instruction. And then we were very intentional. Every professional development we did, we were intentional about using the 5 pillars of reading to think about what instruction we were doing, and then having a data set to be able to align ourselves to the 5 pillars of reading was really crucial to our growth that we've made in St. Paul. And then one thing that we was new in our process of purchasing a resource, a screening tool that we could use with our students, is now we have data set that every support staff, from our special ed teachers, our EL teachers, to our EAs and TAs, like everybody's talking about the same data, and we're using it to be able to inform instruction. Our special education uses the data to write their IEPs. We also use it for progress monitoring. And it is, like I mentioned before, teachers were asking to screen in 9th grade and now even in 10th grade. So it's been an amazing growth over the past 3 years. And like I said, monitoring growth. That's my favorite part about this whole thing, is that we're able to really look at what are we doing to help students grow. So growth data protocol. So one of the things that we do in St. Paul, there's a couple things that I think have been really successful in our re-looking at the way we inform instruction, is using our data, but also using a data set that we look at our data in St. Paul at an administrator district level. We look at it at a principal, admin, leadership team level, and we also look at it from teacher to classroom to grade level, kind of a protocol. So we really examine what's happening in our data. And so we have this activity that we typically do. So one of the things that FAST does that I think is brilliant is that students are identified in their reports around proficient, like are they some risk, high risk, low risk, or college pathway. And so one of the things that we do is we have this document that's on the screen that is, we write students' names based off of a report, who is proficient and who made adequate growth. And we write their names down, and we talk about then what are some action steps. So as a classroom teacher, teachers would go through their data, write the students' names, and then we talk about what are you going to do about that? Like, what are we going to do for students who are proficient and made adequate growth? Then the second category is proficient but did not make any growth, because what we know in literacy, or what we know in education, is we expect students to make a year's worth of growth in a year's worth of time. And so if we see that students took the test in January and they were proficient, but they didn't make any growth by January, what are we doing? So then who are those students and what are the action steps? And then in our third box is we talk about students who were not proficient when they started in September, but made growth in January. So then we write their students' names down, and then we write down what their action steps. And then the final quadrant is for students who were not proficient and did not make adequate growth. So I'm all 4 boxes. So thinking about proficient, not proficient, did they make growth or did they not make growth? So then we talk about students who made growth. What are we going to do with them? So keep going, doing what you're doing. And then the actions, what are the action steps? To analyze, and you'll get a copy of this in the handouts, and analyze the data, look at what the students are, keep doing what you're doing. Then the second category is proficient. Let's say they came in proficient in September, but they did not make growth. So what kind of questions, either an administrator, classroom teachers to themselves, what were the possible reasons that they didn't make growth? What does guided reading look like? So then taking the information we know about those 5 pillars of reading, or what's good literacy practices, what do we need to do to help them get there? And then what kind of action steps are we going to take? Analyze the benchmark data. All right. So that's then the third category, not proficient, but made growth. So these are the students that came in September, were not proficient at their grade level, but have made growth. Keep doing it. Keep going where you're doing that. Did the student make adequate growth? And why did they make growth? So how can you continue what you're doing? How can we recognize the rigor in the work? And so then what are those action steps? And then the final category is not proficient and did not make growth. And so these are the students that we're most worried about. because they came in during the school year, but they didn't actually grow in January. And so, are my mini lessons light and focused? What is the structure of my small group lessons? So then providing some questions for teachers to be able to, record some of their information. And then what do we need to do about that? So then in this protocol with teachers, we go through their screening data in FAST, we go through their growth data, and that's what the beauty of the Fastbridge system is. There's multiple reports with multiple things to look at, as well as then instructional decision-making tools. So what are some interventions we could do? How is it tied to phonics, fluency, comprehension, and what do we need to do with that? But before we could do that in St. Paul, we really needed to look at what do students know? How can we really zero in on students by doing this growth data protocol? We were able to really, as I mentioned earlier, empower teachers to make instructional decisions. And so I have questions. I'm more than happy to answer any questions about the Fastbridge system, how it worked for us in St. Paul, and there's my email address.
Sue, I actually do have quite a few questions that came in, if you don't mind taking a couple moments now before we pass the microphone back over to Dr. Wagner. The first is, what phonics program do you use in St. Paul Public Schools?
We just last year purchased, after an extensive curriculum adoption, reviewing lots of materials, we are using Fountas and Pinnell phonics spelling, word study spelling program.
Thank you. And does St. Paul Schools use reading recovery for first graders?
We do not. We used to have it, but due to funding, we do no longer use or have reading recovery.
Okay, excellent. And then let's see. How much formative assessment do your teachers use?
How much formative assessment do our teachers use?
I wonder if maybe a different way of asking that is, can you speak to like how many screening periods you do a year, and then maybe like what your general progress monitoring cadence looks like?
Yes. Yep. So we use Fastbridge 3 times a year, kind of as we would call it both formative and summative, because we use it at the beginning of the year, the middle, so September, January, and then typically in May. So it's a 3-time administration. And then in between those windows, we are encouraging teachers to progress monitor almost weekly for our students who are below grade level, significantly below grade level, to twice a month for kids who are sort of in the middle. And then kids who are proficient, we're asking at least once a month.
Thank you. Super helpful. A few more just came in here. Someone is wondering what intervention curriculum you use.
So in some of our schools, we use the leveled literacy intervention materials from Fountas and Pinnell. So that's kind of one program. But what we found in St. Paul, based off of our data, is we really have a tier 1, or what we would call core instruction. And so we're really zeroing in on that classroom teachers are using interventions, and Fastbridge actually has assessments recommendations inside of some interventions that teachers can use with students. But we also are really focusing in on our core instruction. We use the workshop model, so doing focusing on independent reading and guided reading.
Excellent. Are you by chance collaborating with your school librarians? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yep. So we, in our elementaries, we have, I can't remember exactly, if out of our 44 elementary schools, particularly, I think we have 7 librarians maybe. And so we are very much in contact with them. But we also have a partnership with our city of the St. Paul. So we have we call it Library Go. So every student has access to the public library as well. So we do in the schools that have librarians. Otherwise, schools that don't have librarians, they have teacher or educational assistants that support checkout of libraries. And then we as a district really have prioritized classroom libraries in our classrooms as well.
Excellent. Do you use a Basil program in your reading groups? I hope I said that right.
Yeah,
Basil or
Basil. Yeah, Basil. So we are currently in an adoption year of buying new mini lesson materials. So no, we use the workshop, reading and writing workshop framework. And currently right now our materials are I think it's called Mondo Benchmark, but we've had it for over 10 years. So we are in the process of purchasing Fountas and Pinnell mini lessons.
Okay, I have a batch of questions related to like remote assessment and remote instruction. But before I send those over to you, I'm wondering two different things. One is on one of your slides, you mentioned, made adequate growth, and that was a terminology you used.
Yes.
How do you define what is adequate?
Yes, good question. So, Kyle, I think you might have an answer from the Fastbridge side because we use the recommendations from Fast.
Yeah, so we do have an answer, fortunately. So what we do is we norm everything, right? So we norm the scores, we norm growth also. So we have a nationally representative sample of just thousands and thousands and thousands of students, and we look for what's typical growth. And so, what's 50th percentile, 25th percentile, 75th percentile, and we base cutoffs for adequate growth on those national norms. So it sounds hand wavy, but basically we're taking into account typical growth of students all over the country from representative groups and saying, how do kids normally grow? And we've determined a cutoff to say, if they're growing below this, it's not really adequate growth. Similar with our proficiency scores and our cutoffs for some risk, low risk, high risk, and college ready is all based on those national norms.
Excellent. Thank you. Super helpful. We have a half an hour left, so I am going to field a few more questions over to Sue, if that's okay with you, Dr. Wagner. We figured this would happen. This is like the juicy part. Sue, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to your special needs population, and wondering how are you taking into account their growth? What does that look like? Is it a different process for evaluating when you look at the quadrant? What is considered adequate? Or if you could just speak a little bit to how the growth has been among that population.
Great question. And I think, the biggest thing, we can get hung up on the percentiles and the numbers and all that kind of stuff. But really what we're looking for is growth. And so if students are, the Fastbridge system has their growth report, kind of lays it out very nicely for us. So we can look at percentiles of students that have met the 50th percentile for growth, and then kind of think about our instruction that way. So when we think about our special ed students in particular, we are really looking for, we have students who are not at grade level, but made what we would call aggressive growth or adequate growth. And that's kind of how we look at all of our students in St. Paul, whether they're special ed, EL, and so that we're able to say, okay, if we're saying that they should grow this many, what we would say points, or this much percentile, are we seeing that that's happening? And they still might be below grade level, but we want to see that they're actually growing. So that's kind of how we use, kind of look at the reports that way.
Mm-hmm. So let's transition and talk a little bit, Sue, about what life has been like since COVID is here. And I know that St. Paul Public Schools has been largely doing remote learning. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know that you guys ever had a sustained period of in-person learning. Is that right?
We've been out of school since last March.
Okay. So can you speak a little bit to how you were using your assessment program in this setting and what that looks like? And in particular, one question is, if you are administering them while students are at home, which I assume you are you seeing that kids are getting a lot of help from their parents, and how does that affect your analysis of the data? And I know after your anecdotal story on that, Dr. Wagner probably has some things to add to this, as this is something that I know our researchers have been studying as well, as the effect of taking these assessments at home.
Yep. So I think, with anything there, we're certain that families have helped students with their assessments. But what we found when we did an analysis, our district did an analysis of the data, is that we weren't finding that from a typical beginning of the school year to a COVID school year start, that the data was all that much different. And so we, because we use it really heavily as a teacher. It's called Formative Assessment System for Teachers. So we really stress the idea that this is one data point in a series of what kind of student work are students turning in and things like that. And so we know that in some cases, it's like, this isn't quite what students are turning in for their work virtually. But what I've always said from the very beginning when we started this process of kind of looking for a new assessment tool is, if the data causes you to pause and go, this isn't what I'm noticing about student work, that's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's causing us to re-look at our students and then gather more data. We often like to talk about it to triangulate it with other types of assessments we're doing, doing a running record. And then, so what does that data tell us? To what does Fastbridge tell us? To what does student work tell us? And so kind of triangulating that data to really look at that. So we did find in some cases we had kindergartners or first graders who were reading, at the 8th grade reading level. We, for the most part, recognized that probably wasn't as accurate and then had support that they needed. So then the teachers did a running record. So we did find it, but what I said to our district kind of leaders and administrators is, we had in the fall 17,000 students assessed. So we had some technology issues, connectivity issues, like all the things I'm sure all of you have had when you've been not in person. But I said, we have data on 17,000 students that we can use to help inform instruction. And so we made the decision this fall that we were going to kind of go for it and see. The upper grade students, there was less support. So it seemed what people would say a little more accurate for some students, but overall, generally, it has been reflected. It has been reflective of what our students in St. Paul know.
Excellent. Dr. Wagner, I don't know if there's anything you want to add just purely from the research.
Yeah, just a bit. And this is something that we were concerned about from our research end as well, and looking at what was happening. So we've looked at distributions of scores kind of across ability levels and across grades. And we are seeing some things that are suggestive of maybe some help at home. We might have a larger number of students appearing in the 99th percentile, for instance. We should see 1% of students in the 99th percentile, and we're seeing a little bit more than that in some grades. But we're not seeing egregious 90% of students are getting help. We're not seeing scores that are all over the place and really wacky and weird. What we're seeing is maybe a slightly higher concentration of students at that top 2 or 3 percentile. But we're still pretty confident in what we're seeing. And again, just like Sue said, one, protocols, right? What are we telling parents and teachers? What are teachers telling parents? And that's, please don't help. We need to get an accurate picture of students. So make sure that your student is doing their own work. Other kind of remote protocols that we've published and that I'm sure St. Paul Schools is using of how to do it appropriately, but also telling teachers and schools and staff that if you have a student and their score is an anomaly, it just doesn't seem quite right for the student. This is a kid who is in the 50th or 60th percentile pretty consistently, and now they're in the 80th or 90th or 99th percentile. Take a second look, do another administration, and try and grab a data point that's maybe a little more representative. So it is something that we've thought about, something we've looked into. And it's something we've released some guidance on to some degree, but it hasn't been an overwhelming issue.
And I think the other thing too that's such, what I appreciate about the Fastbridge system is that you can look at previous data. So we've encouraged teachers to look at, if they're a 4th grader, look at the 3rd grade reading scores when we were in person, look at the 2nd grade reading scores when we were in person to see if there's any, like, how discrepant does it actually look like. But we gave an option for January to have teachers, we're going back in person in February. So we adjusted our window, and we had multiple schools, multiple places that still want to administer it over the computer versus waiting until we come back in February, because they felt that the data was reflective of the students, and for the most part. I don't want to say that there weren't issues with families and people helping with kids, but for the most part, we had schools now choosing to assess because they don't want to wait till they get back in February in person.
So, Sue, when you are analyzing your data, are you thinking of this school year as its own baseline due to the pandemic when you're comparing it, or are you using the scores from last year as a way to evaluate whether or not students have been making growth?
Currently, because we just are going to enter, we're just starting to assess. So we don't really know what the growth looks like yet. So
from fall to winter.
From fall to winter.
Okay.
And so we'll probably keep it as more of a separate, using the previous year's data to just do a second look to see for kids who the data might not reflect what's being turned in for work, or the way that they're showing up in their guided reading groups, even virtual ones, things like that. We've encouraged teachers to take that data kind of as it is, and then do running records, extend their time to find other ways to look at what students know as well.
Okay, excellent. So I do want us to move on to the next section. There's a variety of questions that I think we can answer at the end, some for you, Sue, and some that I think would be best for both of you to weigh in on. But as a way to kind of tee up your last section here, Kyle, which I know is going to be sharing with us, considerations that we should have when choosing an assessment system. Could you just briefly tell those who are asking, how long does it take to administer Fastbridge assessments?
Sure, and Sue may have a slightly better idea of some of these than I do, but it's gonna depend a bit on the assessment we're talking about, right? Something like our adaptive reading or adaptive math, I believe, takes in the neighborhood of 20 minutes is what I've seen when I've observed students in schools. Is that about accurate for your kids,
yeah.
Sue?
What we use, because that's a big question that was asked when we first started using the assessment, and we wanted to reduce testing time. So we, on average, say it's about 30 minutes of an assessment, give or take. It could be 20, it could be 35, but for the most part, it's about 30 minutes to give the assessment. The early reading assessments for KN1 are 4 mini assessments, is what, subtests is what they're called. And those, we don't do we try not to have all 4 in one sitting, but that is about 30 minutes a student. So we just say on average 30 minutes is all it takes about. Yep.
Sure. And also we've got, things like CBM reading, which is going to be 3 minutes, right? Yes. It's a pretty standardized protocol. It's pretty brief. So 3 minutes on the short end for some of our CBM measures and shorter measures. 20, 30 minutes is probably a good guess in general.
Excellent. With that, would you mind transitioning, Kyle, to the last section here?
Not at all. I would love to. So Sue just did a great job presenting on what they're doing and how they're using things. We've talked a bit about what reading is and how we might want to assess it via some different tools. And again, how Sue's district is using these concepts effectively. So now what we're going to do is talk about what makes a good assessment solution. So Sue is using the Fastbridge suite of assessments, but these kind of guidelines I think are good to keep in mind no matter what system you're looking at and what you're thinking about. So, number one, we want to talk about assessments that are psychometrically sound. And so really we're talking about reliability and validity when we're talking about that. And these things have some very specific definitions, right? So reliability you can think of as how consistent a measure is, right? So do all the items on the test measure the same construct, right? If I'm doing a reading assessment and I've got a bunch of questions about sight words or phonemic awareness or something like that, and I throw in what's 72 times 13, that's silly, right? That's not consistent. It's not reliable. And that's an extreme example, but even in general, we want to make sure that, for instance, our early reading measures, they're pretty specifically, they're pretty tight. We have a letter names assessment, and it's all letter names. We're not going to throw in a reading passage in the middle of a letter names assessment, because that's really measuring two different constructs. Does the tool act the same across users? So we want a tool that is going to act the same. It's going to measure a construct, measure an ability, no matter who the student is or where they come from. And this is in terms of disability status, free and reduced lunch status, race, ethnicity, geographic location. Obviously, scores are going to be different based on the student ability, but we want an assessment that isn't biased, either from the colloquial or the kind of jargon term of mismeasuring based on student background. We want to measure the construct, and we want to measure it the same across all users. And finally, does it work the same way today as it works next week or next month or next season? So we don't want it to measure the construct differently because of time or between forms, right? A lot of our assessments have different forms, and we want to make sure that Form A and Form B and Form C and Form D and Form E all measure the same construct and measure it in about the same way. So the classic kind of depiction when we talk about psychometrics and we talk about reliability and validity is we look at hitting a target. And if we've got a construct that's measuring different things between different students, that's measuring different things at different times, that just isn't consistent, what we're going to get is a pattern that's grouped far apart, where that first data point is measuring something very different from the last data point. And that's not going to be good. When we talk about reliability, we want a tight cluster. If we're taking 4 data points, we want them all to look just about the same, given the same ability. Now, that being said, reliability really is only talking about consistency, right? Reliability isn't talking about accuracy. This other cluster of dots, the yellow cluster over there, that's also a very reliable cluster. It's measuring the same thing over and over and over again, but it's maybe not measuring the exact thing we want to measure. And for that, we want to turn to validity. Validity is asking, does the tool measure what it's supposed to measure? Again, you wouldn't put math problems on a reading assessment necessarily, right? You wouldn't put science questions on a social studies assessment. You want to measure the thing that you care about for that purpose. And does it measure it in a way that makes sense? And so, if I want to see how much water is in a glass, I can take a ruler, and that ruler is going to measure the same amount of water, whether it's spring or summer or morning or night, whether I'm holding the ruler, whether Sue's holding the ruler. It's always going to say the same number of inches of water in the glass. Unfortunately, that's not a very meaningful measurement, especially if we put that water in a bowl or in a tub or in a champagne flute, right? Then the measurement's going to change based on context. Almost like our example of if we had students from different geographic areas that all have the same ability, they might score different on the assessment. That's not a reliable assessment. In this case, we're really not measuring the construct in a way that makes sense. What we want to do is we want some measure of volume. We want to measure the construct in a way that makes sense. We want to measure, when we're measuring phonemic awareness, we want to give an assessment that's really going to get at the heart of phonemic awareness. We're talking about fluency. We want to use a good reading CBM measure that measures accuracy at a rate of speed. So this is validity. It's accurately measuring the construct that we care about. And reliability and validity, they're partners. They go hand in hand. So that's one thing you definitely want to look at. You want to find a tool that's been vetted psychometrically. There should be documentation. There should be technical reports. Maybe it's vetted on an outside site like NCII has their tools chart, right? You want something that looks good psychometrically. Number 2 is ease of use. So a tool can't do its job if no one uses it. If no one picks it up, it's a waste of time and a waste of money and a waste of training. So think about stuff in your everyday life. Chore lists, right? We've got them hanging in our fridge upstairs for kids. Nutrition tracking apps, right? Like MyFitnessPal or Weight Watchers, or behavior management systems, or kitchen devices, anything, right? If there's too many hurdles, you're just not going to use it. You're going to maybe pay the money for it. You're going to take all the time setting it up. And 2 weeks later, because it's just too much of a hassle, it's gone by the wayside. Nobody's touched it. That's a bad tool. That's a tool that you're not going to want to use because it won't have buy-in across your district or across your school. And so my example for this is upstairs in my kitchen, I've got these two tools. The one on the left is a garlic press. And my wife uses it all the time and absolutely loves it. It's great for pressing garlic, but it's too many parts and too many steps between me and garlic. I'd much rather just grab my chef's knife and chop it, mince, and put it in what I'm making. So I never use this thing. It's just too much of a pain for me to clean. The thing on the right is my rice cooker. And it's got a ton of bells and whistles, just a million of them. But at the end of the day, if I want to make rice, I put in 2 cups of rice, I fill the line to the 2-cup line, and I hit start. And that's it. Like 45 minutes later, I've got an amazing batch of rice. And I can do other things with it. Frankly, I could bake a cake in it and it's great. But it's a simple tool that's easy to use. And so at the end of the day, one may be not terribly expensive and not have a lot of uses, but I'm just not going to use it because it's a pain for me. And the other one's great. It's easy to use, so I use it all the time. And so you got to find a tool that your staff and that you as a teacher or you as a principal are going to use to look at the data. It can't be arduous. It can't have a million steps. It's got to be something that's intuitive. And the data has to be easy to access and interpret. There's got to be some good visuals and figures. There's got to be some good flags and markers. Next, it's got to lead to a course of action. This is incredibly, incredibly important. So when I was in my school psych program, once upon a time, I had a professor who every single class period, like seriously, every week for a year, I heard this. All assessment should lead to intervention. If you're not doing something with your data, you've just wasted student time, teacher time, and money on your assessment, right? At the time, we might have been talking about, doing a Woodcock-Johnson or a WISC, which is going to be 2 hours with the student, plus your scoring time, plus your interpretation time, plus writing the report. If you're not doing anything with that data, you've just wasted all that time and resources. So every assessment should lead to intervention. That means it's got to be a tool that's sound. You can trust it to make a decision. It's got to be a tool that's relatively easy to use so that your staff is actually going to use it and actually look at the data and use it for doing something. And then it's got to map onto something. So, if I'm giving my universal screeners and 80% of my students are below where I want them to be, that's a tier 1 level change, right? That's the assessment leading to an intervention change. In this case, it's not an intensive intervention. It's kind of a school-wide, hey, let's look at our curriculum, let's look at our practices and figure out what's going on and what we can do. Or maybe I look at it and, hey, there's 20% of my students who are below where I want them to be. In that case, we're talking about tier 2 intervention. And again, my data should lead me to the interventions that I want to do. And same thing at a more intensive 1 to 5% level, tier 3, we need an assessment tool that's going to lead us to a set of steps, something to do next. So, we need again, a tool that doesn't get used can't do its job. And there's got to be a clear connection between the assessment tool and what instructional steps should follow. So once again, a good assessment has to be psychometrically sound. If you can't trust the numbers, you shouldn't use it. It's got to be easy to use. If nobody wants to use it because it's such a pain, then no one's going to pick it up, no one's going to play with it, no one's going to actually use the data. And number 3, you've got to take that next step. You've got to take the data you've got and you've got to design a course of action, whether it's a individualized, very intensive intervention, a group intervention at tier 2, or a tier 1 kind of curriculum change. It's got to lead to a course of action that you're going to do. And it might be, hey, all of our students are amazing. We're like woebegone and everybody's above average. And so we don't have to change anything. But hey, keep an eye on it and monitor, right? There's going to be something you're going to want to do down the road. So whatever tool you're using, make sure it's passing those check marks. So again, looking at our solution in particular, Fastbridge is it's a screening and progress monitoring solution. We try and do all these things. We try and have a good psychometrically based system. We try and have something that's easy to use. We try and have something that feeds into other data sources and works alongside other data sources that people can make good decisions.
There's a few key questions that I really want to address, Kyle, quickly. I wonder if you can just speak to how Fastbridge compares to NWA, to STAR, the variety of other assessments that are out there. Several people have asked for that particular question.
Yeah. So are people asking more about kind of like the logistics of taking the assessment? How long do they last? Are they asking for kind of psychometric properties or?
No, I think it's more just like why choose Fastbridge over NWA if you had to give a reason. Or Sue, you could answer this as well, knowing that you switched.
And we actually did use NWEA for multiple years, and then we chose to switch to Fastbridge really primarily because it's, I hate to say it, it's a formative assessment system for teachers that actually drills down to growth as well as instructional ideas. So taking that, so when the reports show up and it says a student needs help in phonics, there is even some suggestions about what that looks like. It does the whole class, the school, the district, and I know NWA does all of that, but the RIT scores didn't zero in enough for us to help us figure out what we were actually going to teach. So we made the decision to move from that, partly because it was really a teacher-friendly tool, and it gave us the information to help empower teachers to make instructional decisions.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that because I haven't lived in NWEA very much or iReady or STAR. Once upon a time, I was working in a MAP district, and I remember it being used primarily as a 3-time-a-year screener. Sue, do they have a lot of progress monitoring tools or things to do beyond those three? And so I think that's kind of the one major difference is kind of the system that goes from a 3-time-a-year screening benchmark tool and then feeds into a progress monitoring system that you can use to really break down, again, 5 pillars of reading and target student and classroom needs. But again, I'm not super familiar with those systems.
No, that's fabulous. Thank you. I think the last thing that I'd like to address is maybe an elephant in the room, which is just like assessment is fine and dandy. I'm paraphrasing some comments and questions I'm hearing, but like, how do we take into account that not only is this year extraordinary and challenging, but students have like real life they're dealing with, and how do we make sure that we're doing more than just zeroing in on one data point, but really addressing like the whole needs of the child and taking into account where we are now with COVID and school disruptions. I don't know, Sue, if you've heard similar sentiments from your teachers and how you've tackled that and kind of like what your professional stance is on that.
No, I think it's something that weighs on my mind. It weighed on our mind in the spring. We did not assess our students just in the middle of a pandemic and just not knowing what was happening. But and this sounds sort of a sales pitch idea, but Fastbridge is really easy. 30 minutes for 2nd through 9th grade students on an iPad. It gives us data points that just kind of help support with, in addition to, we have lots of supports for social emotional, we have lots of things that we're telling teachers to do in literacy to kind of recognize all of the things that they're dealing with inside of school as well as outside of school. Particularly in St. Paul, we've been not in school since March of last year. So, making the decision to use the assessments in the fall was really so that we could say, there's all this controversy in the country that kids are falling behind and we have all this learning loss and we have all these things. And what we're finding is, students aren't as behind as everybody says that they are. Some kids, this has not been an easy transition for all of us and, students in particular as well. But then using that to say, where are we going to then target we've asked teachers to prioritize phonics. So if you're going to figure out what you're teaching virtually, like prioritize phonics and the rest will come behind, or guided reading, like how can we support students reading text and things like that. So it was meant to support teachers in making those instructional decisions, and the tool is easy enough to administer that it isn't. And then for our KN1 students, we did make it optional because we said it's a elbow to elbow, student to student administration, that you put the data inside of FAST. And we just said, you know what, given that they're kindergarten and first graders, kind of choose what you wanted to do. And I would say that we had 63% of our kindergarten teachers decided that they wanted to use the assessment. And so that says that they're like looking for data to kind of say, where do I need to drive my instruction, and then what are my biggest bang for my buck kind of thing from the data, so that I'm, being a little more strategic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think kind of piggybacking off of that, one thing we're seeing, and we'll have a white paper out early next month, is we're not seeing a huge drop in scores. There is a drop, and it's very consistent. It's there, but it's not been a huge drop broadly on the aggregate. Again, there's individuals everywhere who are certainly struggling. So there's that, and collect the data, because you want to know how your school is doing in general. You want to give a reliable assessment several times to see how things are going for your school and your students. The other side is this is a thing that I harped on a lot. When I was a school psych once upon a time, is don't look at one data point. Don't. You get the best tool in the world. Don't look at one data point. Look at the same tool over time. Look at multiple different tools. Look at student behavior, attendance, work products. Like, anytime you're doing these decisions, whether you're talking about the gestalt of all of my students in a school or a district or a classroom, where you're drilling down as a student support team or problem solving team and saying which students need extra help, you shouldn't look at a single score. You should never do that. You should look at an array of data, including, attendance reports, any scores that you have on the student, past scores. We really need to be looking 3-dimension.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I think, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Sue, I know you have generously offered to share your email address, and it does seem like there are quite a few questions for you still. So, thank you so much for sharing that. If you don't mind throwing that into the chat before we end this webinar. I just want to thank Illuminate Education once again for sponsoring this event. If you would like to learn more about the Fastbridge assessment solution, which is a K-12 solution, an assessment system, just go to fastbridge.org, and you can either request a demo, or you can read around to understand more about both our academic and social, emotional, and behavioral assessment offerings that we have for anyone in all 50 states. Thank you again for all that you do for your students on a daily basis, and we hope to see you again in a future webinar. Thank you, both Sue and Dr. Wagner, for your time today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.